This video is completely extracurricular. It doesn't give you any talk about any assigned reading or even anything that is, part of internally of the course. But it's the kind of thing that if we were to be meeting in person, I'm sure I would have mentioned by now in class and probably uh, read these poems aloud, or at least referred to them. You're halfway through, or so, more than halfway through a course on death, so that you have read more in the last 6 or 7 weeks about death than most people ever do. And you've thought more about, I would say, at least the philosophical issues, um, of which we've touched upon some, about death, more than the average person probably is called upon to do, at least in a focused way. And, you know, that is what it is. But I also, and I think it's good to have done that. Obviously, I enjoy teaching the course. So. But I think that in terms of your background reading on death, your references, you've got a bunch of them. You've got Epicurus and Nagel and Plato and existentialism and Hans Jonas, and now you've got Paul Landsberg. But I thought that it might be something interesting to add to that background reading, to add to your references, some of the great poems written about death. And I'm just talking here about a couple of them. The first one, I think, by John Dunn, which is a holy sonnet number something, but is usually known by its opening line, "Death be not proud," is my personal sort of favorite, and maybe one of the best poems ever written, I think. And but definitely, I would say my candidate for the best poem I've written about death. "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me." Very famous lines, and the problem is that when you do hear these lines, people tend to stop there, which is too bad, because if you stop there, you don't really get the full position and really an explanation for why Dunn is talking to death and telling death that death has no reason to be proud. I mentioned this poem specifically because we're in the middle, or we just read Paul Landsberg's essay from a very Christian perspective on death, and this is another Christian perspective, Christian view of death, which only emerges in the later lines. "From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou," and remember, he's speaking to death, he's saying, "thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison more and sickness dwell. And poppier charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die." It's a Christian view of death. It's written by somebody who's convinced of the resurrection of the dead. And it really isn't until we get to the last two lines that we realize that it's a Christian poem. "One short sleep past, we wake eternally." That is, death happens to human beings, but like Landsberg, Dunn believes that death is a transition to eternal life. That is, we have to go through, as Landsberg says, the straight and narrow gate, the ordeal of death. But the Christian promise is that through that gate, on the other side, is an eternal life, that we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Again, emphasizing the really the victory of Christ over death. "Death, thou shalt die." And so I would say it's not exactly the same Christian perspective as Landsberg. Landsberg ultimately does think that Christianity is the victory over death, but death as menace, death as threat. He doesn't dismiss the importance of death, perhaps as clearly as Dunn does. But just an incredible poem, and something I think that can really add to your background. Reading Dunn makes me think of Dylan Thomas's great poem on death. I think it was written mid 20th century, but it was written on the occasion of the death of his father, and where most of us are familiar with that. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you can read it for yourself, obviously, probably. Many of you know it. It's a wonderful poem. It's one of the great 20th century poems, I think. And I thought of it because I was thinking of Dunn, and if Dunn is sort of saying, "Death, you're nothing. You can't hurt me." Thomas is saying something else that does remind me of Landsberg. I mean, one of the amazing things about Landsberg is that Landsberg kind of sanctions us to say death is an evil. Death is a bad thing. Death is our enemy. And the fact that we die is a kind of a tragedy or something offensive. And there's no poem that I know of that captures a definite feeling of that death, that it's completely proper to resist death, to rage against it. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage against the dying of the light. Don't go gentle. This notion that the human is very existentialist, I would say, probably too. And Landsberg is existentialist in a way. But this frank sort of stance that death is the enemy, and that when death closes in, that's something that we should be righteously indignant about. It's a pretty amazing poem. I think this is another thing that most are familiar with. The most famous thing that Shakespeare ever wrote, the "To Be or Not to Be" soliloquy from Hamlet. But we don't usually we know the first few lines, and obviously, if the first line is "to be or not to be," it's about death. But it's much more than that. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. He's talking about suicide, right? To die, to sleep, no more. That death is just sleep, very Epicurean. And by a sleep, to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, as death as an escape from our troubles. But then it becomes more complicated. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. And that's, Hamlet is thinking of death. He's thinking maybe death is a solution to his problems. And he has to pause because he realizes he doesn't know what comes after death. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. Who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes? When he himself might his quietest make with bare bodkin. Like, why, given how hard life is, why don't more people commit suicide, I think is what he's saying. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. Pretty grim view, but that given how difficult life is, the reason that people don't tend to commit suicide is that they're afraid that what comes after death is actually worse, because it's the undiscovered country. That the dread of something after death is, worse than life. Death as the undiscovered country, which is really one of the great characterizations of death. Of course, Epicurus would say it doesn't make any sense, but others who are more open-minded, perhaps, about the nature of death would. It is one of the great poems considered by itself about death. The only other thing that I would recommend that I know and really love is this poem by William Butler Yeats, a great Irish poet of the 20th century. Oh, you know what? Got it wrong. He wrote two. It's not Byzantium, it's Sailing to Byzantium. That's how much he loved Byzantium. He wrote one called Byzantium and one called Sailing to Byzantium. This is also a much quoted poem, which is ultimately about mortality and death. And to me is the great Platonist poem. That is, if we think about what Plato's view of death was, death as a liberation of the philosophical soul, at least from the body, so that it could finally get true knowledge, but that knowledge was of the eternal things. And there's something of that yearning for the eternal that you see in this poem here. That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, the birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel-crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. He's talking about nature, and he's talking about, the things that natural living things do, like reproduce and fall in love and engage in all the activity of life. But that's no country for old men. Old men think about different, for them, that's all over, right? An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Now, Byzantium had a certain meaning for Europeans, Westerners of that time. Byzantium, the great civilization that succeeded the Roman Empire and had its own history and its own 1,000-year-long existence. But in the Western European mind, it was viewed as a civilization that was stuck in a kind of a time warp, but that just persisted without change, which I'm sure is not true, but that was the stereotype of Byzantium, the idea of a place that was not subject to the same sort of roiling change that most societies are, that would just sort of, static rather than dynamic. So that's why he's chosen Byzantium as an old man, what he wants, O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, purn and gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. So the mosaic is the Byzantine mosaic. You've seen them, the kind of like Eastern Christian art form. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. And that's where we find out that Yeats, the old Yeats, wants eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bow, to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. Great, great poem, my goodness. But it is about death. It's about mortality, and it's about the longing for immortality. The longing of an old man who's who's lived his natural life, who's done the kind of things that young people do, and now is yearning for something more permanent and eternal. Christian, sure, and also, but a kind of a Platonistic Christian, rather than a Landsbergian Christianity. So I just wanted to send this out. I think that if you're familiar with these poems, it'll just enrich the kind of reading knowledge you now have on the issue.